recap a little bit for people who weren't here the first time, and I have some new information as well. So we'll just kind of touch base on the early Maquoketa theaters and then talk a little bit about Preston and some of the other theaters that are around Jackson County. So, as we said last time, maybe the first movie theater, and we're searching for information here, and we're searching for pictures. So if you know these things, please let us know. But we think that the first movie theater in Maquoketa was the old Lyric Theater, that it was originally on North Main Street, we know, but we don't know where. We know, according to a newspaper article in 1907 that we talked about last time, that the Lyric had to suspend operations because their lantern operator was arrested for thievery. He was not a Jackson County person, he was somebody that the movie company sent here, but we know that they were up and running because of that by 1907. And we know that in 1910 they had made a lot of improvements to the theater. They had a riser, they had ordered 200 opera chairs, and again, they were still on Main Street, and it's just listed as the most convenient location in town. Doesn't tell us where, and so we're thinking that perhaps it was Centennial Hall. And the admissions at that time were 10 cents for adults and 5 cents for children. So we also know that on October of 1911, the Lyric Theater had to leave the Centennial Building. This is the Centennial Building. And we know that they had to leave because Adam Ringlip, who was the big hardware man in Maquoketa, had purchased this building, he had remodeled it, and he was making a huge hardware store there. So the Lyric Theater had to move. Again, we don't know where they went. We know they went somewhere because there were ad after ad after ad about the movies that they were having, but nothing ever tells us where. So we're looking for all of that information. We also know that in 1913, the movies consolidated, and there was a man from Vinton, two men from Vinton, W.M. Weber and George Saunders, that came. They bought the Pastime, they bought the Lyric, they bought the Olympic, and they kind of combined everything, or running everything under one name for a long time. And that name, Weber, comes up a lot. He had a lot to do with things that happened in Maquoketa. We learned that at this time they were running 10 vaudeville houses, many motion picture theaters, 2 opera houses, and an air dome. And we know that they were building an air dome, or they were scheduled to build an air dome in Maquoketa. That's kind of a open air, it's not a drive-in theater, but it's kind of an open air theater. And they were, because theaters were hot and stuffy back then. And so it was a big deal in the news, but then I don't think it ever came to be because we can't find any more about it. We talked last time about this wonderful old building, the tall building, the Masonic building. Such a wonderful landmark in Maquoketa, and it has so many lives. It's where the Orpheum Theater was, in this Masonic building. It was there for a couple of years, and then it was purchased by someone else, and it became the new Orpheum. And it was a real thing by 1913. And in this picture, we see them getting ready, remodeling that same building to have their big theater there. And we talked about how all these little stairways were all up and down Main Street, all up and down the business streets, and you would go down these stairs, and there were businesses on the lower level of almost every building, every business building in Maquoketa. And this again is the Orpheum Theater when it's finished. It must have been quite something to see. It seated 415 people, had modern steam heat, a huge stage, and they talked often about the steel ceilings and the 4 exits because they were always worried about fires and safety. And one of their big things in their advertisements was that they belonged to the Mutual Film Association, and so all of their movies that they were shown were so well done that there was nothing that would possibly offend anyone. And so everybody was welcome to come and bring their children. It was all family oriented. And they had their own special orchestra, because remember back then, they were all silent movies and there were no words. The words were on the bottom of the screen sometimes, and then the little orchestra would play music in the background to set the mood for what you were seeing. And then, in 1919, at this theater we just looked at, now think of this, Maquoketa was not very big. In 1919, 2,300 people saw the movie Mickey at the New Orpheum Theater. They always try to have the very latest movies to keep all the business in Maquoketa. And so then came the Pastime Theater. Okay, and the first time we've heard of a Pastime Theater in Maquoketa, if you remember, was in 1919. Joe Roberts and Max Wright. And they were in the Rice Block, in a little up-to-date playhouse. And they had a wonderful little motion picture business there. The Rice Block, if you think of where Goodwill is now, that's where the Rice Block was. Mortimer Rice had his opera house there, and the post office was there for a while. Many, many things were there. So, well, let's talk about the fire that was there. We know that the Pastime Theater moved then to this area on Main Street, and it operated there for a little bit of time. We know that it had its official opening there in 1912. The newspaper was right, or the post office was right next to that. And again, they talked about how they had great ventilation, big fans to suck out the stale air. And the seating capacity was 400 people. And I found another interesting tidbit. By 1914, the U.S. Postal Department decided that they could no longer mail film. They used to, excuse me, I know I'm going to sneeze. They used to mail, excuse me, they used to mail the big rolls of movie film. They would get them in the mail. 1914, the U.S. Postal Department decided that they were no longer mailable because they were explosive and inflammable objects. And so it was too dangerous to mail them, but they were in all of these movie theaters where they were so worried about fire. Okay, so there we see the fire of 1915. At that time, the Pastime was owned by Brinker and Robinson, and they still owned it in 1925. So they're the ones that would have rebuilt it in this same spot after it burned. And this whole area that you see that burned is the Cook Block. That's where the Lane Furniture Store was, and the Ellis Dentist offices up above. That whole thing was burned. So you can look at the front and see how the front was at the time of the fire. Then when they rebuilt, this is what we had in the front, the Pastime Theater. So that was 1916. By the time it was rebuilt, it was a $30,000 structure in the same spot, and it opened on the 2nd of August. And we looked at a picture, this is my favorite picture, I think, of all times, on the inside of the theater before 1921, again, they were silent movies. And so there was always a place for the orchestra along the front. And we know that Odette Keeney played piano at the Pastime Theater in her early years to set the movie. I know now if we had that, Ann Knight would be playing. She could do that. Okay, and we talked about Stuart Peake, who came in 1921 with his father-in-law, Mr. Hippler. They took over the Pastime. Now he's the one whose wife was like the bird in the gilded cage, the beautiful lady that sat there and sold tickets. And I found out too now that they owned the Pastime, they owned the Orpheum, and they owned something called the Fern Theater that was in Oxford Junction. And so I'm wondering if that was the theater that was there before the Cozy Theater, maybe. So, okay, so this was Mr. Peak. He became quite a figure in Maquoketa. As you can see, he even became mayor from 1932 to 1937. So he did a lot of fun things for Maquoketa. And I found these, now this also came from, remember I said that Dennis's family has been giving us artifacts for the last little bit as they were going through and cleaning out things. This is a financial statement that I thought was fun from 1929. And so, as you can see, Mr. Peak owned this at this time. As you can see, this is the front side of their stationery. And it has the map of Little Maquoketa in the middle, how well located we are, and some of our favorite things for people to see. That's what's on one side of their stationery. When you turn it over, this is their business side. Pastime and Orpheum Theater. And I thought it was interesting because this is for the year, this is their business sheet for the year of 1929. Okay? And here they are, the Pastime and the Orpheum Theater, and you can see that they suffered a loss of $606.96. 1929 was a tough year in our country, right?
Oh, yeah.
Very tough. And so, but here we have the Fern Theater. That's the little theater that was in Oxford Junction. And you can see that they had a profit of $628. So that was just interesting how that worked out. But you can see how much they paid their employees and how much they paid for lights and everything else. And Express Freight, $1,750, I think it says. That's because they could no longer mail the movies. They had to pay to have the movies brought by truck. And if they changed their movies every other day, which they did often, that was a lot of shipping charges that they had to incur then. So I just thought that it was interesting to see that. So you can see that they own the Pastime and the new Orpheum. And we talked about how it was interesting that there were two movie theaters owned by the same people. They were competing against each other, you would think. And yet, if there were not enough people during the week going to the movie, they just operated the Pastime Theater. On weekends, there were too many people. They couldn't all fit in the Pastime. The business was so good. So then they opened both of their theaters. But after a while, the Orpheum became a miniature golf course. And when that fad went away in 1948, it became the Chief Theater. And Dennis also gave us film records and receipt books from the Chief Theater in 1948. They've been wonderful, and they've donated some really, really good historic things that are really good for us to have. And we really appreciate those. So this is the space this is after the Chief Theater closed. So you can see them tearing this all out, and they made it then into a business. So that was all gone then. So when we talked about Mr. Hippler and Mr. Peak, who were running the Pastime, one of the neat things was that we know that in 1930 they spent $2,500 on this electric sign. And you remember it cost them $60 a month just to run this sign. Colored incandescent lights that flashed intermittently, displaying the feature being shown and the principal stars. And so it was supposed to be the big asset to Main Street. And then we talked about Dennis, and how Dennis was 19 when he came to town to go to work in the new radio station. And it's just interesting that today, all these wonderful things from the radio station are just pouring in upon us. So you know then that the radio station has definitely been sold. The new people are getting ready to take over. Robbie Manning, who's bringing these things and saving them from the landfill, and deserves so much credit for that, trying to save those things. So, talking about Dennis, we know that one spring morning in 1972, he had been over in the green mill having coffee, and when he walked out of the green mill that day, he had purchased the 61 Drive-In Theater from Bud McKenzie. We know that about that same time Ed Kirchhoff had bought the Pastime Theater from the Des Moines company that owned it, Mr. Peak and all of these people. And he announced that he was tearing down the Pastime to make room for the new Schultz dime store. And so businessmen in Maquoketa, again, this all happened at the Green Mill, businessmen in Maquoketa then convinced Dennis to buy the Pastime. And so in November of 1972, remember he bought the drive-in in the spring of 72. In November of 72, he purchased the Pastime Theater. And he knew when he bought it, the terms of the agreement were that he had to close it on the 31st of January of 73, so he didn't operate it very long in that spot. But that's how he got the new Voy Theaters on South Main Street, where they are now, or just were. The IH Farm Implement Store had been there. Before that, the old Dustal and Waters Implement Store had been there. The first theater had the rocking type seats, air conditioning, and opened in 1973. Dennis opened that in 1973. In 1975, Dennis added Voy 2, and Voy 3 he added in 1981, making it the first triplex, or the only triplex theater that was ever in a small town like Maquoketa. So just put us on the map again, I think. Found out from going through some of the papers that they gave us that Dennis also owned the Castle Theater in Manchester. And he bought that in 1977 and owned it sometime into the 80s at least. So that kind of catches us up a little bit on some of the things that we had talked about before. So, look at this. One of the things that we need a lot of help with are the old theaters that were in Baldwin and Monmouth. Now we know they were there. We know that by looking at this advertisement that you see here, the Harmony Theater in Baldwin, Iowa. We know that in this store right here, upstairs, was an old theater, but we don't know if this was the Harmony Theater or a different one. So we're trying to find all that out. We know that the Monmouth Theater was in, the Coloma Theater was in Monmouth, because you know, Monmouth back in the day had been known as Coloma. And we have tickets that Kathy Applehus donated to us. And it was fun because the price of the ticket, if you can see it there, 49 cents plus 1 cent state tax, making the ticket 50 cents. So, again, do you know what?
Before the theater was built, they showed movies up above the Bristol store.
In
Monmouth.
In Monmouth.
They, up there was it had been a theater at one time, but the backdrop was there, the ticket offices, and we used to have, that's where we did our school plays, because it had all the seats and everything. But it was a fire trap because the steps were very tall,
Okay.
and narrow, and just one set of steps to get up and down over the Bristol store.
Wow. Do you know anyone that might have any pictures of that at
I
all?
don't know anyone. Well, you know, it's all torn down.
Sure, it's all gone now.
No.
Oh, thank you for that. All right, that's good information. We will put that in our files. Well, the thing that we know the most about in other towns is the Lyric Theater, but not the one in Maquoketa, the one in Preston. We know about this because of the wonderful book, Preston, Iowa, 150 Years of Life and Times. And I'm sure you've all seen it. Hardback 2, hardback copy books, volume 1 and volume 2. They're both upstairs for sale. They're well worth the price. They're very, very well done if you'd like to own a copy. But some of the things that we learned about, and partly from that, about the Lyric Theater, was that it was on Gillette Street, and it was a magnificent theater for its time. Ernest Krabenhoff opened the establishment, which was built from the ground up for the purpose of being a theater. It had a seating capacity of 200, and supposedly it contained the best equipment to be had at the time, and the architecture and workmanship were top-notch. So if you look at this old, the old marquee, I guess you would call it, how really nice that was. It was all made out of iron and colored glass, and it was handsomely illuminated with electric lights. So that picture also came from the Preston book. Alvin Krumvitty took over the operation of the Lyric in December of 1913, and then when he entered the service in World War I, he sold it. And for 18 years it was owned by several other people. Charles Lindenau, who we've talked about before here from Maquoketa, was one of the men that had that for a couple of years. And then on New Year's Eve of 1920, he turned the keys over once again to Alvin and Mabel Krumvitty, and they owned the Lyric then for a long time. Mabel was manager, and it was said to be one of the finest small town theaters anywhere. She ran it until 1946, and then it was sold to a Moline couple, the Pershings. But we know that it was still operating in 1952, and we know that the building still stands. There's a couple photographs of the inside, the early interior of the theater. In the front there was a stage large enough to have vaudeville acts, because remember back in that day they had both. They had vaudeville acts that came in and used the stage, and then they showed motion pictures also when they could. The screen was on the rear wall, and it was treated with a special blue finish for that purpose. And I would guess that this is that screen, and this is maybe a little later, I'm guessing. There were 200 comfortable seats, and some of those seats, ta-da, are in our museum today. And they are comfortable. I've sat on them. They're very nice. The building, so this was kind of interesting. The building was steam heated, and they went on to say that it was as near fireproof as it could be made. The operator's room were large and conveniently arranged with fireproof walls and ceilings. And then we have this picture of the Lyric in 1946 after the fire. So evidently all their precautions did not help. There was a terrible fire in 1946. And next to it I just had to, I had to put this ad, though it's from 1918. And look at it. And I find several ads for the movie theaters like this. So they change their shows nightly, and on Saturday, December 25th is a show that will please you. Doesn't tell us the name. On the 22nd, another special feature. And Wednesday, a special program for Christmas. So I just thought that was interesting. Can't tell you what the movies will actually be that week. And that just goes to show that there's a precedent for announcing upcoming brown bag lunches, because we don't always know what those are going to be either. But from the book, I just think that Mabel Krumvitty must have been a very wonderful person. Know if anybody, I don't know when she died, so I don't know if anybody here knows her. Did anybody know Mabel Krumvitty? Well, a few things that I learned about her from the book, that she spared no time. She managed this movie theater, right? She spared no time or money in equipping the theater. She installed a machine to make it possible to run a continuous performance without stops between the reels. Because remember back in the day when you went to the movies, they'd have to stop and change the reel. Or how many of you remember when a film would break and you'd hear the noise and then you'd have to wait for them to put everything back together again? Well, she got that all fixed. She continually redecorated. She installed music equipment to furnish synchronized music. And when the earliest silent movies came, she brought talkies to Preston. And I think that was in 1929. But then it was interesting. Everybody was waiting. They wanted to see the first talking movies. And she delayed the opening of the first because she wanted to be sure that everything was perfect. She found that she had to do, in her theater, she had to do quite a lot of padding and draping to eliminate all the echoes. Because in that big building, there were just all kinds of echoes, and she just wasn't having it. It had to be perfect. So she worked diligently. But I found too that not only was she a great businesswoman, but Mabel Krumvitty was a very community-minded woman also. And this was during wartime, and she did all she could for the war effort. And so she held a special scrap show one February. It was a holiday, maybe President's Day or something like that. There was a double feature playing The World at War, was one of the movies, and the second was a Western featuring John Bat Brown called Little Joe the Wrangler. So she announced to the people of Preston that they were going to be giving a chance to do a little good on that day by bringing scrap to the movies. You couldn't buy your way in that day. You had to bring aluminum, brass, copper, rubber, clean rags, or grease. And that's how you got in. She posted that the usual admission prices were 16 cents and 33 cents for a child's ticket, 16.33 for an adult, and that junk was 4 cents a pound. Now I heard Phil say yesterday that our junk out here is now 6 cents a pound. So, the American Legion Auxiliary members were there to help with the scrap metal collections, and the proceeds went to the March Red Cross Drive. Or if there was an alternative, you could bring a good book. And the books were going to go to the men in service, and a good book was one that you would want to keep yourself. If it wasn't a book you wanted to keep, then it wasn't a good book, and don't bring it. So I just thought she was really interesting. Another thing that she did, Mabel Krumvitty, is she got together a drive to collect clothing to send to the Russian civilians because it was wintertime. The Russians were facing a very bitter winter during war. Preston packed up 1,200 pounds of shoes, coats, and all imaginable wearing apparel, and they shipped it off in October. But unfortunately, it all went to the bottom of the Pacific because the ship was sunk by a German submarine. So she tried. So she was there until 1946 when she retired, and the Krumvitty sold the Lyric Theater to the Pershings from Moline. And they continued to operate it until 1952. And so if you enjoyed some of these little stories, please get your copy of Preston, Iowa, 150 Years of Life and Times. We have volumes 1 and 2, and one of the authors is sitting right back there. They're all autographed already though, right? Don, yes. So Don and Dick Kunow and Cheryl Reagan. Never can say that name. And they're wonderful books, really well researched and well done. Okay, so we found books, information, and Dennis's things about the Cozy Theaters. And Dixie told us that there was a Cozy Theater in Oxford Junction that was owned by Otto Sheddick. Sheddick, okay. But then we found out, when Karen Brown was here last week, we found out that there was a Cozy Theater in Jackson County. It was in Bellevue. And she brought us information about that. Does anybody remember that? The Cozy in do you?
I think so, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the Cozy in Bellevue.
My dad, he proposed to my mom there after buying her a 10-cent hot dog, I think it was. And then he had the ring in a box of Cracker Jacks.
Oh, that is a neat story. Okay, the Cozy in Bellevue. Well, we had just a little bit of history of that was written by Susan Luckie for the preservation of Bellevue heritage, and it was the Cozy, Bellevue's fine new movie theater that originally opened May 19th of 1913. And the first movie location we know was not this, it was in the Adler building on Front Street.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me where, I don't know where that was.
I think it was over by Lukey's, where Lukey's
shoe
shoe
store?
shop is
Okay.
right on that block, I believe.
Okay, so that must be where it was originally. And they always advertised that the movies changed every other day. Every other day you could go see a new movie. Of course, there was this Saturday matinee with 2 shows each night. And back then, a man by the name of James Collins managed it. And he sold it several times, but like happens today, sometimes you sell things and they end up coming back to you, right? So he ended up with it again. So in 1916, he ended up with the Cozy Theater again, and this time he moved it. And he leased part of this new building. This is the building today, probably. But he leased it. He leased it, and there was a man by the name of McKillop, who had in the lower level of the building, he must have driven around behind, and in the lower level of the building there was a repair shop. So, do you know anything about that?
Was it on the river?
Yeah.
I think it
Yeah,
was.
yeah, right along the river there.
Yeah.
Okay. And is this what it looks like today?
Yes.
Okay, it looks like this today.
I think is it the eyeglass place now? I think.
really don't know. I don't pay
I think it's some optometrist has it now.
Okay, but you can just kind of imagine with the way it's designed that, yes, it was a movie theater at the time.
Little window.
Yeah, yeah, and there's a little window to buy your ticket, huh? I don't know how the bird in the gilded cage would look in that window. I'm not sure. Oh, gosh. Well, in 1930, it was remodeled to show talkies, and then by 32, it was showing movies 4 nights a week. And of course, this building was used more than just movies. There were stage performances. The whole town used it. There were concerts, and there were lectures, and there were graduations of kids from different things. And so it was a popular place for all kinds of events, even people who were proposing.
Yeah.
But the chamber, the fire department, the American Legion, the banks, everybody held their special gatherings at this building. And after a while, we're told that it contained a very busy snack bar and a lunchroom, and it was still the Cozy Theater into the 70s. We don't know exactly when it ended, but the building is still prominent on Riverview Drive. So we're going to talk just a little bit about the 61 Drive-In Theater. So these pictures are very good. They all came from newspapers. But this is as you can see, the original wood screen. So it was 1950 when the new drive-in theater near Maquoketa began, almost 75 years ago now. And the men who built it were Richard Franklin and Walter Allen Jr. And it was in all the magazines, all around, newspapers, all over the state. It was built as a rustic design. Had a tilted screen, lighted speaker posts, and you remember those, I bet. Bottle warmers for the baby, and I was in the first Iowa installation of sound and screen equipment specifically designed for outdoor theaters. So when it was first built, it was very, very special. Later, we know that it was owned by Bud McKenzie. It's Bud McKenzie, Catfish McKenzie. Catfish McKenzie, okay. Until 1972. And then, again, we talked about how Dennis Boy had been enjoying a cup of coffee in the Green Mill, and he walked out owning the drive-in theater. So, that was over 50 years ago, to put things in perspective. But Dennis said, and this is quoted him from several newspapers, he said that he thought it would be a good thing for our radio station to own a drive-in theater because you could promote it on the radio. And Dennis ran this as a family operation for a long time. His children, his grandchildren, everybody was involved in this, and they had a very good time for it. One of the things he says that he did change, and it was a dramatic change, was that very soon after he took over, he replaced the little speakers that were on the pole. Who remembers those little speakers? Remember those?
Yeah.
And they had two little speakers. Two little speakers on each side, and one went to each car, and this cord that connected it. I just have to tell you a little story. I had a little Croswell that my dad took in on a tray. We didn't have money, but he took it in on trade, and so I drove this little Croswell, little bitty car, looks almost like a Volkswagen bus. And four of my girlfriends or three would fit in there, and we'd go to the drive-in. Well, you drove up this little embankment, right? And you put the speaker in the window, whatnot. Well, this little car had an emergency brake right in the middle between the driver and the passenger. And we're on this incline. Well, invariably during the movie, one of my friends, couldn't have been me, one of my friends hit the little brake and it would pop off and we roll down the bank. Well, then you couldn't see, right? And probably we damaged the cord on the, probably that happened too. I don't remember that, I probably did. So then I'd have to start this little car and drive back up, but it was a very noisy little car. And so people would honk their horn. Those are my memories of the drive-in theater. It's just kind of funny. It was really nice that Dennis was able to change this, and he took those out. And because of his knowledge of radios and the radio station and everything, he arranged so that the movie soundtrack would now be played over your FM car radio. So you didn't have to contend with that little thing. You know, if you opened your window and put that in your window and it was really cold out, it got cold, the bugs came in. It was just annoying. So Dennis was able to fix that. He said that the theater used a low-power radio transmitter to provide the movie soundtrack for the customers. So then in 2003, now we're over 20 years ago, okay, he updated the facilities. He doubled the size of the little building, bigger concession stand, more restrooms, plus air conditioning. And so 20 years ago, the following was true. So one of the last drive-in theaters in Iowa was his. There were two others in 20 years ago. And he had just started his the theater had just started its 54th year. The other two then were in Newton, Iowa and Council Bluffs. Those were the two. I think there's one more now. There had been more than 50 in Iowa at this time, and there were 4 in the Quad Cities alone. But everywhere across our country at this time, drive-ins were starting to fail. And it was partly because of increased land value, took up quite a lot of land. And especially if you were in a bigger city, that land became valuable. And so drive-in theaters were disappearing for that reason. Also, it was partly due to the introduction of video rentals. You know, you could go down to the video rental store and you could watch your movie at home. So those were some of the reasons. But Dennis felt that his business really turned around, and it turned around because of a disaster. In April of 1995, there was a severe windstorm that toppled the drive-in screen. And people from all over the state were asking, are you going to rebuild it? What are you going to do? And so after a lot of consideration, he finally put up this new screen. And he said that since he built this new screen, his business had increased every single year. Other things that he said helped to make his theater exist for over this long period of time was nostalgia. A lot of people remember, they'll take their kids to the drive-in where they used to go. The expansion of Highway 61 to 4 lanes, so it was easier for people from away to get there. And in the last couple of years, I know if you're driving in and it's almost time for the movie to start, there'll be cars lined way up down the road waiting to get into the drive-in theater. So that's really pretty neat. But he felt that the other very big change came when the audience changed from a teenage crowd to mostly a family-oriented crowd, that was a big change. And that family groups were starting to go to drive-in theaters because they were looking for economical entertainment.
Bonnie,
Uh-huh.
I want to interject and say,
Good.
my husband and I took tickets when we were first married out there,
Okay.
and that was back in '78.
In 78.
Yep.
And tell everybody what you found around the yard.
Well, anyway, Dennis used to have all-nighters, what he called all-nighters, and Richard and I used to have to pick up the grounds, and there was a lot of interesting things that we found. So,
Tell a few of the interesting things.
like bras and underwear and things like that. I mean, it was interesting.
I noticed that one of the comments was that, thank you, Arlene. One of the comments was that Dennis always had either G, PG, or PG-13 movies. So that's what he did, and I always admired him for that.
He did have some X-rated movies when they had all-nighters too.
Oh,
so,
did he?
yeah.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Really?
Well, one of the articles that was written up about the theater talked about how the fact that it was good family entertainment, because he didn't have X-rated movies, you didn't have to worry about your kids. You could take them, but of course you better keep them in the car with you, because walking around in the other car with teenagers might not be that good. So it was funny. But Dennis always advertised the fact that it was a family-oriented thing. It was economical for families to come. You could bring your own food. He always welcomed you to bring your own food. People would have tailgate parties, with their friends. You didn't have to pay a babysitter. You just brought the kids. There was usually a kid movie first, and then when the kids were tired and fell asleep, there was a movie maybe for the, something for maybe older people. So he had, I don't know if I have a picture. There he is with his new concession stand in 2008. And that's when he built the bigger stand and improved the restrooms and made more restrooms. But there was always a sign at the front. There was space at the drive-in for 300 cars, and there still is. And there were many times that every single space was filled, so that there was always a sign at the entrance that said this: to avoid disappointment, bring your own lawn chairs or a blanket and a portable radio. Then you can park outside, walk in, and still enjoy the movie. So I thought that was pretty neat. He had...
Connie, again, I want to interject. Anyway, his mother-in-law used to make the best Maid-Rites. We used to have Maid-Rites out there.
I didn't know that.
And, Arnold Myers' wife. Yeah, anyway.
So say the name?
Helen and Arnold Myers.
Helen and Arnold Myers, okay.
And she used to make the best Maid-Rites. I don't know what she put in them, but she always brought Maid-Rites or made Maid-Rites out there.
Wow, that's really neat. So they had good food, or if you were on a budget, you could bring your own. All right, so here's the famous little train. I think I read where they've worn out 4 trains so far. And that always, people would start coming to the drive-in by 6:30 anyway, even though it didn't get dark and the movie didn't start until 9. They'd come at 6:30 to get their good seat, right? Get the place that they wanted to be. And there were some playground equipment up front. There was the little trains that kids could have free rides. And one year, Dennis was so neat. We had Pioneer Day one year. He actually brought the train in so that we could give free rides for Pioneer Day. And I felt so bad. It kept breaking down. And so Dennis would send somebody to fix it. He furnished a guy to run it the whole day. But he also had to get somebody to fix it. But he let us borrow his train that one year. So they wore out 4 trains. But it's just been a wonderful, fun thing for families. And I think that, there's one of the old projectors that they used. And that looks a little more like it does today. And then I thought this was interesting when you look at it from afar. So I just think that Maquoketa is so fortunate to have one of the 3 or 4 remaining drive-ins in Iowa. I think that's just really neat. And Dennis has done so much over his life to provide good, healthy, fun entertainment for adults and children alike. And so I hope everybody signs his card. We'll just send him another card. And so does anybody have, in a couple minutes we have left, does anybody have anything to add? I appreciate your comments and knowing that Mary's parents got engaged at the Cozy Theater. I think that's awesome. Kathy?
Yeah, I was going to say, one thing I remember about working at the Pastime, you were talking about the U.S. mail wouldn't carry the movies anymore. Well, in my day, they used to come in on the bus.
Oh.
And they were hard, little weird-shaped suitcases that they from carrying
Did
in.
they have, were they flat? They were kind of a canvas with straps
Yeah,
that buckles
Yeah.
on each side and then a handle?
yeah.
Ah, okay.
And I don't know, today they probably just send them over the internet. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know what happens to, everything is digital, I suppose, but, Roger,
The first movie I remember outdoors was in Springville, and they
Okay.
showed it on the side of a building. They all stood outside.
and watch the movie. Oh, that's neat. Was there ever a indoor movie in Springville or Springbrook or any of the other little towns? Fulton, did Fulton have a movie theater? Does anybody know? Well, if you ever come across any information about early movie theaters, we just want to add to our archive, so we,
I want to add too that about Jack Jones and how
thank
he
you.
put in over 40-some years at the drive-in and at the Voice Theater, so.
Thank you for doing that. That was part of my thing that I must have skipped over. And they just had a retirement party for him on Sunday, I
I
understand.
think so.
So that was great. Thank you for remembering that. That's good. So it was just a good time. A good time. Any other stories?
Walden also showed movies on the side of the bank.
On the side of the bank, that little bitty bank?
Well, yeah,
The little
old-
bank.
old
The old bank that's so little. Really?
We live close, and we, I don't
Okay.
know how often, anything,
How often they did that?
sit on the grass, and watch a movie.
Huh, that's really neat. I know in my family, there's always, my family came from Fayette County, and my grandfather always had bakeries, grocery stores or something, and so they showed movies, put up plank benches, and he made strawberry pop. And they had strawberry pop in their movies. So, those are the good old days. All right, so thank you very much. Please, if you can come, it'll be a wonderful program tonight at the Fairgrounds Museum, okay? And we will have our annual meeting. So hope to see everybody there. So thank you very much.